This piece is going to take some work. And please know that underneath the pastor where you have staff and ministry teams, it may change from time to time. That's where the flexibility comes in and should be to help you flex with the changing goals or maybe even a changing vision from time to time. So know that Jesus Christ, the board, the pastor, and nominations is set. But everything under there can ebb and flow depending on your vision and your goals of the year. Does that make sense? Okay? So this is a piece that I want you, if you are getting ready to move into this model, make sure that you have this piece put into place before you start practicing it. If you're practicing it, and you don't have it, you need to start there and figure this out. Because you see, when we don't have a very clear organizational chart, it's really hard to tell how the decision-making happens. Right? Can you see that? Who's responsible to who? Who do I report to? And so on. All right, so we're going to transition a little bit into strategic planning and how that aligns with the whole work of accountability. When we aim at nothing in particular, that's exactly what we hit. That's exactly what we get. Nothing. Strategic ministry planning helps us aim. Now, when we're talking about strategic ministry planning, we're talking about 5 different pieces. All right? The first piece of strategic ministry planning is understanding our mission. Y'all, if you heard nothing else from me today, if you go away with nothing else, I just want you to clearly understand why we all exist as churches. And that's our mission. That's our purpose, is to make disciples. Everything we should do should be aligned with our effectiveness and our efficiency in reaching those that don't have a relationship with Christ. Everything needs to flow from our mission. Now, the vision, remember, this is what would drive the upside of the life cycle. So vision is extremely important. Now, if some of you, your stomach just turned when you thought of vision, I just know it. Because we go, didn't we just do that? Well, maybe so. But the vision, if every purpose is the same, each one of you are here, your churches exist for the same reason, is to make disciples. So why doesn't every church look the same and function the same? It's because their vision is different. And the differences in vision comes from those differences of your community, the differences in your congregation, the differences of your gifts. It's God's preferred future. It's the unique way that you go about making disciples. We have to make sure that we can paint a picture to say, if a photojournalist were to come back to your church in 2 years, what is it that he or she would find? What would you look like? What would be happening? How would it look different than today? I don't care about bumper stickers and T-shirts. Folks, this isn't about what's in your head. This should come from your heart and your soul. And it should be wrapped in prayer so it's guided by the Holy Spirit. It's God's preferred future for your church. And if you believe that that's not what's currently happening in your church, then it's time to revision. See, people can get excited about a vision. They can go, oh, I can see that. I want to be a part of that. You know, I say it's not very sexy to be thinking about, well, yep, we're just paying bills. Yep, we're making payroll. Yep, we're doing that dinner for the 25th year. How exciting is that? You see, when you can't go out and let the community know what you're excited about, what do you have to talk to them about? Why would they want to be a part of the church if you're not even excited about being a part of the church? And it's hard to get excited about being a part of the church if you don't have this vision of God's preferred future and that everything is lined up with how we're going to live into that preferred future. Any given mission field has a 70% likelihood of people that are disconnected from the life of a congregation. 70% of people don't have a relationship with Christ. We don't have to worry about what other churches are doing. There is plenty of work to be done, and there's plenty of people to reach. 70%, friends. Now, we can bellyache about the change in attendance patterns. We can bellyache about the cultural differences of all the options that are available on Sunday. Yep, all of that's reality. You are absolutely right. But how can we be concerned about that when the 70% of our general population don't have a relationship with Jesus Christ? There is plenty to do. And do you have a vision in your church that people are excited about, want to be a part of, and it is driving you for your purpose of making disciples? Now, the next thing you want to be thinking about, the third part of strategic planning, are those goals. So once you have that vision of God's preferred future, the goals then don't come from, so what should we do this year? Because that's sometimes what we do, right? Goals just come from la-ti-da, what feels good, what's the church doing down the road? But instead, the goals are, if God is calling us to that preferred future, what are the things we need to do this year to get there, to make that a reality? Do you see how everything starts coming together? We no longer have these little silos of things that are just happening in the life of the congregation just because. But we're all rowing in the same direction, all of us, for the purpose of making disciples and moving into our preferred future through the goals. And remember, if we go back to the agenda for simplified structure, remember right there in the center was review of goals. So every month, every time you gather, that's the conversation. So how are we doing of reaching those goals? So do you see, you're not really asking about how are we doing with reaching the goals? What you're saying is, what are we doing towards the steps of our vision becoming a reality? Because the goals came from the steps that were desired or determined what it would take to create that vision. So do you see how it's all aligning? So I go back to the question in the back of the room of what's the importance of going away and immersing ourselves in this process? Do you see how you are creating the momentum and the direction for the church for the upcoming year? And folks, if we don't have people willing to give up a 24-hour period to do that, then might I dare say we don't have the right people in leadership. Because we've been filling spots instead of calling people into discipleship and leadership. I would much rather you have your minimum of 9 people who are truly committed than to fill it up with 13 just to say we have more people. Because if they're not fully committed, they're not going to show up at that retreat. They're not going to live out their covenant, and it's going to hold the leadership and the church back. If you can't get fully committed people into a particular ministry, then don't do it. I would much rather see you do much fewer things, ministries, activities, events, and do them really well, as opposed to trying to be all things to all people. You know, what are you known for in your community? What are you known for? And friends, I hope it's not fundraising. Seriously. Because if we want to get to the heart of that matter, if we're doing fundraising, we got discipleship problems. That's a stewardship issue. You see, if that's what we're known for in our community, what does that mean about being the church? They just want my money. I had one church that I was almost ran out of town because I said, let's not do this pie sale any longer. That's what they were known for. We sent in mystery worshipers to ask about the town. What do you know about this particular church? I almost said it. And they said, oh, that's the church that has the annual pie sale. So when you ask then that committee to say, so tell me, how many people have come to know Christ as a result of buying the blueberry pie? Well, that's not its purpose. How does it tie into your purpose? Well, why would it need to tie into our purpose? And you begin to push against that, and then the church then becomes angry because who are you to come in and tell me how to run my church? I'm just suggesting that we follow Matthew 28. Maybe Jesus said how to run your church. But do you see, friends, how we get off track? Because we are not strategic or intentional in the way we're using our resources. I have yet to see a church that is not busy. Oh my goodness, we are busy, 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 busy. But are we busy aligning everything with our purpose? We burn people out, and we have burned out people. For what purpose? No one's come to know Christ, but we've burnt people out in the life of the congregation. Because you see, we didn't have our eye on the ball. Instead, we were consensus driven. Instead, it was more about our relationships with one another. Do we have country clubs? Or do we have missionally driven churches whose purpose is to reach the people that don't have a relationship with Christ? You see, doesn't that change the game? Doesn't that change the focus? But we can't do that unless we're willing to stand back, look at the big picture, and do the strategic ministry planning that aligns all of this. You see, the simplified structure is part of the vehicle to help us to get there. The accountability is what's going to help us arrive. But if we don't put the planning behind it of knowing where we're headed, it's going to be difficult as well. So when we put goals together, this is where we have to challenge ourselves. And some of you that work in the secular world or are teachers, you're very familiar with SMART goals, yes? It's an acronym: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-based. You might have some different words for those, but it all means the same, right? When you write your goals, make sure they're SMART goals. I've seen churches that say, well, we're going to grow the church. Well, tell me how you measure that. Well, we're going to have more children in Sunday school. Great. We're going to have more children in elementary age Sunday school, going from 5 children to 8 children by when? The end of the year or whatever it is, right? You need to make sure you can put it on the calendar of when it's supposed to be done. You need to make sure that you can measure it in some way, that it's specific. And then we need to give ownership of those goals to someone. You see, if it's just, we're going to do, that's great. But at some point, the rubber has to hit the road, and a person needs to be held responsible for those goals. Do you see how the conversation begins to change at your board meetings when we're having these kind of conversations with our pastors? And I think we begin to think about, what are the things we're doing, friends, that we don't need to do any longer? Most churches need to stop more things than they start. The other thing that we have problems with is things that I say have missional shift. I have to be careful how you say that. You see, we start a particular ministry for a particular purpose. And we've done it for so long, we forgot the historical purpose. So let me go back to my pie story. The pastor, 4 pastors ago, gave each of the people on the mission team to say, I'm going to give each of you $10, and I'd like for you to find a way to double that money for us to donate to the food pantry in our neighborhood. Now, how that turned into a fundraiser, who knows? But only one person on that committee could tell me that historical perspective and to say that the intention was to help our community pantry. Because it became about doing it rather than the purpose in which we're doing it and to align in how to do so. Y'all follow me? So again, you came here asking about simplified structure. But what I'm saying is, it's not just about simplified structure. This is not going to be the magic bullet that suddenly people are going to show up in your pews. But simplified structure with accountable leadership can get you to the point of getting your eye back on the ball and begin to align everything so we have a greater possibility of doing so. Now, we talked about strategic ministry planning has 5 pieces, okay? Mission, vision, goals. The 4th piece are core values. Whether you've stated them or not, every one of your churches has core values. Core values, if we go back to our football metaphor, it would be the boundary lines. It tells you how far you can push things or not. And you see, sometimes we get ahead of ourselves that we have core values that keep us our boundaries here, but our goals ask us to get our boundaries out here. So when we haven't identified who we are, then our goals can get us into trouble. So for instance, I had a church I was working with, and it was growing like you would not believe. And everything we were doing, there was no pushback, no pushback, no pushback. I mean, changing worship times, taking pews out and replace them with chairs. I mean, really big changes. Moved across even. We were working on moving the Jesus picture. But you see, they went away and they did strategic planning. And they identified their core values, and they stated them, but then when they worked on their goals, they really pushed the boundaries of their core values of who they said they are. See, because they valued tradition. And all their goals didn't value tradition. So when the pastor went back to the staff and said, all right, these are our goals, so let's line up our objectives, let's line up what we're going to do this year to make this a reality, there was pushback. Well, no wonder, because the goals pushed our core values too much, right? So whether you've named it or not, they're there. So if you have not named your core values, please go through that process of naming your core values. Now, here, name who you are, not who you want to be. That will get you into trouble too. Because most of the time we go through core values and we say, well, this is the fluffy, flowery people we want to be. That is not necessarily who you are. That's not to say that you can't say, here's one aspiring value that through our goals and our revisioning we can grow into. But call it an aspiring value. So think about this. Your core values, your mission and vision and core values reflect who you are on your website, right? And maybe they're even stated specifically. So a person shows up as a first-time guest at your church expecting who you said you were. And they show up and you're not who you say you were because you put aspiring values on your website. You didn't reflect who you were. Or perhaps you put pictures of a youth group of 50 kids and you have 10. Be who you are. Don't give people the idea of being someone that you're not. Own who you are and play within those boundaries when you're making decisions. You know, holding relationships very high may be one of your core values. Name it if that's the case. Even if it's not necessarily who you want to be, it is who you are. So it helps you realistically make decisions in alignment. Now, those strategies is the fifth piece. So we've got mission, vision, goals, core values, and strategies. Okay? Strategies belong to the ministry teams. That's where that work is done. This is what finally gets on the calendar are the strategies that come from the goals, that come from living into our vision, that accomplishes the mission within the boundaries of our core values. Do you see? Nothing gets on the calendar without all of those pieces being in place first. So when you work through all of that, friends, you just did your own ministry audit. Do y'all know what I mean? So what if 2018 started with an empty calendar? And we only put things on that calendar that aligned with our mission, our vision, our goals within the boundaries of our core values. Would that look different than 2017 calendars if the 2018 calendar had those parameters? Perhaps. Perhaps. So if we are going to go into simplified, accountable leadership, the focus, the energy, the conversation must shift. Right? You see, as I've been working with churches over this last decade, here's what I found. We did it for technical reasons, and then it blew the place up. Because we didn't build the trust. We had fewer people making decisions, and we didn't put accountable leadership in it. We didn't understand the model, so we didn't have any guiding principles. We didn't have a leadership covenant. So you're right, when fewer people are running the church and we don't have all those other pieces in place, it's dangerous. So that's why it's important to see how simplified structure fits into all of these other pieces to align your church to be the most effective at making disciples, right? So I want you to spend a few minutes at your table. And I want you to decide where are the pieces of strategic planning that are in place and what do you need to work on? Do you fully believe, start at the top, do you fully believe that everyone in your church understands the purpose? Do we need to start there? The next one is, do we have a vision that is providing energy and momentum and people would know it and be excited about it? Are we there? Have we named our core values? Do we know who we are? And do we put together goals every year that help us live into our vision? And are we strategizing at the board level? Or are we really leaving that to the ministry team? All right. So we are going to talk a little bit about another acronym. I love acronyms. How to hold people accountable. Because sometimes when we think about holding people accountable, we think of that club over the head kind of thing. Pastor, you're doing it wrong. That's not what this is meant to be. So here's the acronym. The holding people accountable is simple. You have to first set expectations. And I find that in churches, we don't do a very good job of that. I mean, how many positions in, whether it's paid or unpaid staff, we have no job descriptions. I mean, how do you have expectations of someone when what you want them to do is not clearly identified? And it's hard to hold somebody accountable against something that isn't documented, right? Then we invite commitment. Do you see, when you hold people accountable, they have to see how their part plays in to the bigger picture. That they're not just doing this thing over here, but their part is important to the bigger piece. And so everyone has their own commitment to making the big picture happen to make disciples. We have to be willing to measure progress. Not just the end game, but how are we doing along the way? which means multiple conversations. Now, any of you that have ever supervised folks, you know that sometimes the supervision looks different than others. If you have a team of 10 people, I used to have a team of engineers. Now, that's a bunch okay? Yeah. And so every engineer had different giftedness. And there are some of my employees that I would say, here's what you need to do, and set them free, and I know it would be done, no doubt. There's others that I would say, here's what you need to do, and in 3 days I needed to call them again and say, now, did you understand what you needed to do? Do you have any questions? And then the next week I needed to call again and say, how are we doing? Right? And there's everything in between. The same is with accountability. Some are going to need more questions and more check-ins than others. But you need to adapt the accountability to the person you're holding accountable. You've got to provide feedback along the way. And that is both encouragement and support, but also to put our foot down, folks, and be willing to say, we're missing the bar. Help me understand where you're getting caught up. What resources are missing? Do you need some training? Do we have too much of a workload on you that this priority isn't getting finished? Help me understand what's getting in the way and how can we be helpful. Do you hear that's much different than say, why isn't your work done? Encouraging, supportive, but also willing to ask the difficult questions. Link to consequences. Yes, we can link to consequences even as a volunteer. If this isn't completed, we're not going to be able to hold this event. If these benchmarks aren't met, then we're not going to be able to move forward in this position. And again, I go back to our earlier conversation to say we're doing people an injustice to allow them to stay in places where they're not fruitful, where they are not using their spiritual gifts. We're doing them and the church a disservice. We have to link to consequences. And we have to evaluate effectiveness. How are we doing at accomplishing what we've asked them to do? And remember, look at that organizational chart. It happens at every level, up and down the line. So imagine, if you're board members, friends, what would Christ be asking you around accountability right now? If you were to say, if we were going to evaluate ourselves, if Christ was sitting at that boardroom table, what would the questions that Christ would be asking of you? And how would we be doing? I'd like for you to take a few moments at your table and evaluate how your church is doing at holding people accountable. No matter where you're at, I'd like for you to identify what would we have to do just to take it to the next level. And maybe we're just starting. And maybe the first level is we need to learn what accountable leadership looks like in order for us to be able to live into it. Or maybe we ask for commitment, but we're not willing to evaluate or hold the difficult decisions. So take a few minutes and identify where your church is and how you can take the next step.